I can still picture the look on Walter's face when I stood up at that board meeting, after 40 years of marriage, after he had left me for a woman half my age. The moment he had dismissed me as nothing more than a housewife who wouldn't understand business. And then, in front of everyone, I revealed that I owned 67% of Reynolds Custom Furniture. That single moment made every second I had spent in his shadow over the years worth it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we dive back in, let us know where you're tuning in from. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow, I've got something even more special lined up just for you. For most of my 61 years, I lived in the shadow of others. I was Barbara Reynolds, wife to Walter, mother to Michael, grandmother to Grace. I prided myself on being the one who kept everything together, the woman who made the perfect pot roast every Sunday, who remembered every birthday, and always sent handwritten cards. My role was clear, though invisible. I was the steady one, the reliable one, the one behind the scenes. It all started when Walter and I met when I was just 20. He was everything I had ever hoped for. Handsome, ambitious, and full of ideas. He seemed to already have the world in his hands when he showed up on our first date in that navy suit, looking every bit the part of a man who had big plans. My father approved of him right away. "That young man's going places," he said with a satisfied nod. What my father didn't know was that, unbeknownst to Walter, I had inherited a substantial amount of money from my maternal grandfather when I turned 18. It wasn't a fortune by today's standards, but it was enough to start something significant. Uncle Thomas, who had always treated me like a daughter, helped me understand the value of keeping my finances separate. "Don't tell the boys," he advised with a wink. "They always think they know better what to do with a woman's money." So, when Walter proposed after just 6 months of dating, I said yes. I didn't tell him about the inheritance, not because I didn't trust him, but because I knew the advice my uncle gave me was wise. After we married, Walter and I started Reynolds Custom Furniture. Walter was the face of the company, charming clients, making deals, presenting at trade shows. I worked behind the scenes, handling the books, doing design consultations, and managing the employees. The initial capital for the company came from my inheritance, but the company was registered in both our names, though technically, it was mine, thanks to Uncle Thomas's careful paperwork. Walter was too excited to ask questions, and I was content to let him take the credit. Our son Michael was born a few years later, and my work-life balance shifted. I cut back on my hours at the office but never really stopped working. Even while I was raising Michael, I would handle office work during his naps. As he grew older, I expanded my hours again, always ensuring I was home before Walter. My mother had instilled in me the belief that a husband needs a peaceful home and a hot meal to come back to. So I managed to run our growing business and maintain our home, appearing to the world as though being a wife and mother was my only job. The years flew by. We moved from our modest starter home to a beautiful 2-story in Maple Grove, an upper-middle-class suburb outside Philadelphia. The business grew as well. Reynolds Custom Furniture expanded into a respected brand, specializing in high-end, heirloom-quality pieces. Walter's ego expanded alongside the company, and as the years went on, the story of our business began to shift. In his telling, Walter had single-handedly built the company from nothing, pulling it up by his bootstraps with sheer will and determination. "My wife," he would dismissively say at industry events. "Barbara keeps the books." It stung, but I never corrected him. I had been raised to be supportive, to stand by my husband's image in public. Besides, I told myself, what did it matter who got the credit, as long as our family was thriving? But things began to change. Michael, our son, grew up idolizing Walter, and when he joined the company after college, he saw me as just his mother, not as a businesswoman who had contributed to building a multi-million-dollar company. He turned to Walter for mentorship, seeing him as the business genius of the family. The first real crack in my marriage came when Walter hired Heather Collins as his executive assistant. She was young, with sleek black hair and an MBA from Wharton. She mentioned it every chance she got. It wasn't long before I noticed how Walter seemed to straighten his tie when she entered the room, How his laugh became just a little too animated when she was present. She's just very efficient, Walter defended himself when I casually brought it up, noticing how she seemed too young for such an important role. The business is growing. I need someone who can keep up. Meanwhile, I was busy ensuring our business ran smoothly. I continued to manage the finances conservatively, reinvesting profits instead of spending on status symbols like Walter did. I quietly acquired additional shares in the company, putting away my portion of the profits while Walter spent his on a vacation home, cars, and a boat. On our 40th wedding anniversary, Walter gave me a diamond necklace, beautiful, expensive, but impersonal. It could have been given to anyone. When I put it on, I realized I couldn't remember the last time Walter had truly seen me. Not as his wife, not as his assistant, but as Barbara, a woman with thoughts and dreams of her own. One afternoon, I came home early from visiting my friend Patty, who was going through a difficult divorce. I overheard Walter in the office, talking to Heather. What I heard froze me in my tracks. I can't keep living this lie, Walter was saying. Barbara's a good woman, but there's no passion, no understanding. You challenge me in ways she never could. My heart broke. I backed away silently, retreating to my car, hands trembling. It wasn't just the affair that hurt, it was how little Walter saw me, how much I had diminished myself over the years. For decades, I had hidden my business acumen to protect his ego, allowed him to take credit for my work, made myself small so he could feel bigger. But no more. I drove to the office, retrieved the paperwork that showed my 67% ownership in Reynolds Custom Furniture, and called Uncle Thomas. The time had come to take back what was mine. I spent the next few days in a haze of anger and determination. After 40 years of marriage, the reality that Walter had been blind to my contributions hit me like a tidal wave. I had quietly put the company's success before my own acknowledgement, but no longer. I was done living in the shadows, and now I had to prepare to reclaim what was rightfully mine. I called Uncle Thomas. At 72, he had retired from active business, but his mind was sharp, his advice always practical. When I told him everything that had happened, including what I overheard between Walter and Heather, he listened patiently and then said, "I always hoped you'd never need those papers. But I'm glad we had the foresight to put them in place. What do you want to do now, Barbara?" The question was simple, yet it marked the first time in years anyone had asked me what I wanted. "I want to take back my company," I said, my voice steady, surprising even myself. "I want Walter to know exactly who he's been dismissing all these years." Uncle Thomas nodded slowly. "It won't be easy. Walter's built his whole identity around being the business genius. He'll fight back." "I'm ready," I said, a new resolve hardening inside me. "I've been fighting silently for too long. Now it's time to do it openly." I didn't go home that night. Instead, I checked into a hotel, sending Walter a text saying I was staying with Patty, who would corroborate my story if needed. I spent the evening preparing for what was to come, researching loyal employees, identifying clients who knew my true role in the company, and reviewing the financial details I would need to prove just how central I had been in making Reynolds Custom Furniture the success it had become. The next morning, I hired an attorney. Samantha Torres, a sharp and no-nonsense lawyer I had met through a women's business network, was just the kind of person I needed. Walter had always dismissed her as too aggressive, but that was exactly what I needed right now. When Samantha saw the documents I had retrieved from the office, proof of my 67% ownership in the company, she didn't blink. "Barbara, you're in a remarkably strong position," she said with a smile that made me feel the weight of the decision ahead. "What's your goal?" she asked. "Do you want to remove Walter, force a sale, negotiate a settlement?" I thought carefully before answering. I still didn't hate Walter. 40 years of marriage weren't easy to erase. But I couldn't continue to be invisible, not now that I had the truth on my side. "I want recognition," I said finally, the words feeling like a weight lifting from my chest. "I want Walter to acknowledge my role in this company publicly. And I want control, the real acknowledged control, of the company's future direction." Samantha nodded, making notes as we strategized. The next step was to call a mandatory board meeting. I had the power to do so as the majority shareholder, and it was time to reveal the truth. "I'll remain in the background," Samantha advised. "We don't want to tip Walter off too soon. Let him believe he's in control until the meeting is officially called." For the next week, I continued to play my role. To everyone at the office, I was still Walter's supportive wife and the diligent office manager. But at night, I worked with Samantha, gathering the evidence to prepare for the board meeting. I called in our head craftsman, our lead designer, and our operations manager, key employees who had worked with me for years and knew exactly what my role had been in growing the company. One evening, I met with Grace, our 26-year-old granddaughter. I could sense her protective instinct, and I was desperate to keep her in the dark about my plans. "Grandma, you're not acting like yourself," she said when I answered her call, sensing something was wrong. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I assured her, but she wasn't fooled. "Is Grandpa giving you trouble again?" she asked, and for a moment, I faltered. "No," I said, my voice soft. "Everything's fine." It was getting harder to keep up the pretense. The night before the board meeting, Walter announced that he and Heather were going to New York for a business trip. "We need to meet with new investors," he explained, "and will probably stay overnight." I felt the calm before the storm. I had everything in place. I contacted Samantha immediately. "They're going to New York tonight," I said. "Should we move up the meeting?" Samantha's smile was razor sharp. "Absolutely not. Let them have their trip. When they return, the board meeting will already be in progress." The day of the board meeting arrived. I was up early, reviewing my notes one last time, feeling the weight of what was about to unfold. I chose my outfit carefully, a tailored navy suit, the one Walter had once said made me look too businesslike. I paired it with the pearl necklace Uncle Thomas had given me when we started the company, a far more meaningful piece of jewelry than Walter's impersonal diamond. I arrived at the office to find the boardroom filled with curious faces. My 3 outside board members were puzzled but intrigued. Michael, our son, arrived last, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. He asked me what was going on, but I just nodded for him to take his seat. At precisely 10 a.m., Walter and Heather arrived, flushed from their trip. As soon as Walter saw me standing at the head of the table, his face twisted into an expression of disbelief. "Barbara," he said, his voice thick with confusion. "What's going on? Who authorized this meeting?" "I did," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "As majority shareholder, it's my right to call this meeting." The silence in the room was palpable. Walter froze in mid-stride, his face a mixture of shock and fury. I watched him carefully, but I didn't flinch. "Barbara," he sputtered, "you're not the majority shareholder." "I am." I nodded to Samantha, who quietly distributed copies of the incorporation documents. "If you'll all turn to page 1, I said, my voice calm, "you'll see that Barbara Reynolds, that's me, owns 67% of the company shares, with Walter Reynolds owning 33%. Walter grabbed the folder from Samantha, his hands shaking as he flipped through the papers. "This is impossible," he muttered. "This must be some kind of mistake." I remained steady. "No mistake. Turn to pages 3 through 7. You'll see the amendments that kept my controlling interest intact, even as we brought on minor investors." Michael's eyes widened as he looked at me, and I met his gaze, holding his attention. "Yes, Michael," I said gently. "I've always owned the controlling interest in Reynolds Custom Furniture. Your father and I built this company together, but legally, the majority has always been mine." Walter stood there, speechless for a moment, before his voice broke. "You were spying on me?" I didn't respond. Instead, I spoke directly to the room. "This isn't a coup. It's simply a clarification of what has always been the truth." The room was silent as the reality of what I had just said settled in. Walter's face had gone pale, his mouth working as though searching for words that wouldn't come. He looked like he'd been caught in a trap of his own making, His carefully constructed narrative about being the sole visionary behind Reynolds shattered in front of him. This can't be happening, he muttered, taking a step backward. His confidence, once so formidable, was crumbling before my eyes. No, Walter, I said, keeping my voice even. This has always been happening. You just never wanted to see it. I turned to the other board members, each of whom was still processing the documents in front of them. We've always run the company together, I said, but now it's time for the truth to be acknowledged. I won't continue to let my role be minimized for the sake of maintaining an illusion. Walter looked at each of them, his usual arrogance replaced by an unfamiliar vulnerability. You can't be serious, he said, his voice cracking. This is my life's work, Barbara. I met his gaze without flinching. It's my life's work too, Walter. And I'm done letting you take the credit for it. The silence in the room grew heavier, and I could feel the weight of my words hanging in the air. Michael's gaze shifted between me and Walter, his confusion palpable. He had always seen us as a unit, his father, the business genius, and me, the supportive wife who quietly kept everything running behind the scenes. But today, he was seeing the truth for the first time. Mom, is this really true? Michael asked, his voice tentative but laced with a growing realization. Yes, Michael, I said softly, meeting his eyes. I've always been the majority shareholder. Your father and I have been partners from the beginning, but I've carried the weight of the decisions that shaped this company. I just never asked for the credit. Walter's face was contorted with disbelief. He reached for the papers again, flipping through them in a frantic manner, as though he could somehow find a flaw in the evidence that would make all of this go away. I don't understand, he stammered. Why now? After all these years? Why do this to me? His voice cracked, and for the first time, I saw the man I had married, broken, vulnerable, and unsure. The question hung in the air, and I took a moment to gather my thoughts before answering. I've spent 40 years supporting you, Walter. I've watched you take the credit for what we built together, and I let it happen. But I can't do it anymore. Not after everything that's happened. Not after what I heard you say to Heather. Walter's eyes darted to the corner of the room, where Heather had been standing silently. She had barely moved since the meeting began, her discomfort obvious. Heather doesn't know anything, he said, his voice harsh. She doesn't understand the business the way I do. No, she doesn't, I replied calmly. But you've dismissed me, Walter. You've dismissed my contributions for far too long. The tension in the room was palpable, and it was clear that everyone was on edge, unsure of what would happen next. But I had made my choice. There was no going back now. As I continued to explain my vision for the company's future, my mind kept returning to what Walter had said earlier. This is my life's work. It wasn't just a business, it was everything he had built, or so he believed. But what he failed to understand was that I had built it with him. His pride had always overshadowed my role, but now, it was time for the world to see what I had done. And it was time for Michael to understand the true history of the company he had worked for all his life. The meeting dragged on, filled with back-and-forth exchanges that I barely registered. Walter fought tooth and nail, trying to cling to the identity he had built for himself. But the more he argued, the more I knew I had made the right decision. He couldn't see it yet, but the old narrative was falling apart. The reality of our partnership, the true partnership, was finally coming to light. At the end of the meeting, I excused myself. I needed time to breathe, to think. The board members filed out quietly, many of them shooting me looks of sympathy or curiosity. I didn't care. This was my moment, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me. I found a quiet corner of the office and sat down, staring at the files in front of me. It was overwhelming, this new sense of freedom. I had spent so long shrinking into the background, waiting for Walter's acknowledgement, that I had forgotten what it felt like to stand tall on my own. Michael came over to me after the meeting ended, his expression unreadable. Mom, I don't know what to say, he said quietly. I never realized how much you did for the company. How much you've always done. I looked at him, his face so like Walter's yet still so different. He had never known me in the way that I had known myself. But he was beginning to understand. I've always been here, Michael, I said gently. But I've been hiding behind your father's image. I'm not doing that anymore. He nodded, his face softening. I'm sorry, he murmured. I never realized. But I'll support you, whatever you decide. His words meant more to me than I could express, but I didn't have the energy to respond right now. The next steps were going to be difficult, and I wasn't sure what they would look like. But I knew one thing. I was no longer the invisible woman behind the scenes. The truth was out, and I was finally visible, not just to my family, but to the world. The days following the board meeting felt like a blur. I spent countless hours reviewing financials, meeting with key employees, and making decisions about the company's direction. Each moment felt like a battle, one in which I had finally reclaimed my voice, but the consequences of that reclamation weighed heavily on me. Walter continued to isolate himself, communicating only through Michael or email. His pride was shattered, and though I knew he needed time, it was hard to shake the feeling that everything I had worked for, our marriage, our company, was slipping away. The house that had once felt like home now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in around me, and every corner reminded me of the life I had tried so hard to maintain. I called Uncle Thomas that evening, needing to hear his steady voice. He had been my guiding light all these years, the one who had always seen my potential when I could not. You've made your decision, he said after I explained the latest developments. Now it's time to see it through. You've built this company as much as Walter has, and it's yours. He may not see it yet, but he will. His words provided some comfort, but they also reminded me of the magnitude of the change I had set in motion. Walter wasn't just a partner in the business. He was my husband of 40 years. The dissolution of that bond was not something I had expected to face, even though it had been hanging over us for far too long. The next morning, I returned to the office with a sense of purpose. There was still much to be done to solidify my role at Reynolds, but I also knew the company needed to adjust to a new reality, a reality in which I was in charge. I was no longer content to remain in the shadows. Michael and I spent the morning reviewing client relationships and upcoming projects. The business was steady, but I could feel the tension between us. There was an unspoken question hanging in the air. How would Michael react when he fully grasped the extent of the shift? At noon, he walked into my office, his expression tight. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, his voice strained. "About Dad. About us." I braced myself. The conversation I had been avoiding was finally here. "What about Dad?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "You've seen the documents, Michael. You know what happened." He nodded but didn't sit down. "I know. But I don't understand how it got this far. How we've been living this lie. Why didn't you tell me, Mom?" I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. "I didn't want to hurt you, Michael. I wanted to protect you from the truth. I didn't want you to have to choose sides." He shook his head, frustration clear in his eyes. "But we've been living a lie, Mom. All this time, I thought Dad was the genius behind everything. I thought you were just the bookkeeper." The sting of those words hit me harder than I expected. For years, I had allowed myself to be seen as nothing more than the woman behind the curtain, pulling strings in silence while Walter took center stage. But now, the mask had come off, and the truth was out. "I was trying to protect us all," I said softly. "I didn't want to disrupt the family. But I realize now that by doing that, I was sacrificing my own worth." I let Walter take credit for everything because it seemed easier than confronting the reality of what we had built together. Michael sat down across from me, running a hand through his hair. "So, what now? What happens with Dad? With the company?" "I don't know, Michael," I admitted. "I'm still figuring that out. But I do know one thing. I'm not going to be invisible anymore. The company belongs to both of us, and it's time for you to understand the role I've always played." We sat in silence for a long while, neither of us knowing what to say next. Finally, Michael spoke again, his voice low. What if Dad can't accept it? What if he doesn't want to be part of the company anymore? I didn't have an answer for that. But I knew that I couldn't let Walter's pride dictate the course of my life any longer. I had waited too long for recognition, and now that I had it, I wasn't about to let it slip through my fingers. As Michael left my office, he paused at the door. I'll support you, Mom. But this is going to be hard. I know, I said, my heart heavy. But I'm ready. I've been fighting for this for far too long. The day felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, but the uncertainty of what would come next still loomed. Walter hadn't responded to my counter-proposal yet, but I knew he would. He was nothing if not determined. What I didn't know was how much longer I would be able to stand by while everything I had worked for, the family, the company, slowly unraveled. That evening, as I sat alone in our house, I couldn't help but wonder what had become of the woman I used to be. The one who had been content with the quiet life, satisfied with the love and stability of her family. Somewhere along the way, she had been swallowed up by the roles I had been forced to play. Wife, mother, partner, always behind the scenes, never truly seen for who I was. But now, I was finally stepping into the light. And while it felt terrifying to face the unknown, I knew that I couldn't go back. I had to keep moving forward, even if I didn't know exactly where that path would lead. The next few days passed in a haze of meetings, paperwork, and difficult conversations. I spent the majority of my time focused on the company, on steering it through this uncharted territory, where the truth was out in the open, but nothing was settled. Walter was still reeling from the shift, and while his pride made him distant, I knew he hadn't given up on the company, nor had he entirely given up on the marriage. His silence was louder than any argument we could have had. The phone rang late on Wednesday evening, the screen displaying Michael's name. I had been expecting this call, but when I picked up, I wasn't prepared for the emotions that surged through me. Mom, Michael's voice was tense, but there was something different in it now. More grown up, more aware. Dad's agreed to the terms of your counter-proposal. He's stepping down as CEO and taking on the role of President of Client Relations. He'll stay involved, but as your partner, not your superior. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Really? I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He's going to do it. He's doing it, Michael confirmed. But there's one more thing. He wants to meet with you. He wants to talk about us. About the marriage. I froze. The prospect of facing Walter again, after all the truth had come out, was a daunting one. But part of me, perhaps the part that had always wanted to be seen for who I truly was, knew it had to happen. It had to. For closure, if nothing else. Okay, I said after a long pause. I'll meet him. But I'm not going back to the way things were. Not unless. I know, Mom. I understand, Michael said quickly, as if he could read my mind. We've all changed. But I think you deserve to hear him out. He's been different these past couple of weeks. I think he's finally starting to understand. I wasn't sure what that meant, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let my future be dictated by Walter's past mistakes. The following day, I arrived at the Riverside Cafe a little earlier than our scheduled meeting time. I had insisted on neutral ground, a place that wasn't our home or the office. It felt more appropriate, more detached, even though the weight of everything still clung to me. Walter was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with his coffee untouched. His posture was less rigid than it had been in the past, though there was still an underlying tension in his demeanor. He rose when I entered, and for the first time in weeks, there was no arrogance in his eyes. Instead, there was something far more vulnerable, perhaps even regret. Barbara, he said quietly, his voice almost tentative. Thank you for agreeing to meet. I know this isn't easy. I nodded, taking a seat across from him. It hasn't been easy for either of us, Walter. But we can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair, a gesture I hadn't seen him make in years. I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About how I've treated you. I don't know how to apologize for the things I've done, the way I dismissed you for so long. But I want to try. His words were simple but heavy. They were the words I had been waiting to hear for decades. But now, they didn't feel as important as they once might have. Perhaps because, after everything that had happened, I had learned to see myself through my own eyes, not his. I've heard your apology, Walter, I said, meeting his gaze. But it's not just about the apology anymore. It's about the years we spent living in this unbalanced dynamic. I can't go back to that. I won't. He sighed, clearly struggling with the weight of what I was saying. I understand. I don't want to go back either, Barbara. But can we go forward? Can we start again? Not as we were, but as something different. As equals. The question hung in the air, and for the first time, I realized that I wasn't afraid of the answer. I had spent so many years putting Walter's needs before my own, keeping my dreams and ambitions in the background to support him. But now, I knew what I had to do. I needed to build a life for myself, not just as Walter's wife, not just as Michael's mother, but as Barbara. I think we can, I said softly, my voice steady. But only if we both change. I need space to be myself. Not just as your partner in the business, but as Barbara Reynolds, the woman who's always had a vision of her own. And if we're going to continue working together, we have to do it on equal terms. Walter's eyes softened. I'm willing to try, he said, the words coming out more easily than I expected. But I understand if you need time. Time for yourself. I won't push you. I looked at him for a long moment, trying to gauge if he truly understood what it would take for us to rebuild anything. Could we rebuild? Or was this just a new kind of partnership we were forging? One based on mutual respect, if not love? I'll take the time I need, I said quietly. But I think we can try. Not as a couple in the traditional sense, but as business partners who finally acknowledge each other's worth. The weeks that followed were strange, almost surreal. Walter and I settled into our new roles at Reynolds, him as the president of client relations, me as the CEO, steering the company into a new era. There was a kind of unspoken understanding between us. Our interactions were professional, but there was an undercurrent of something more, something we hadn't yet put into words. At home, things were different too. I had moved into my new house, the one I had bought for myself. The artist's house. It was a new chapter, a fresh start. And as I settled into the space, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in years. The sunlight poured into every room, and the large windows that overlooked the garden felt like they were giving me permission to breathe again. Grace visited often, offering her support in ways that were both practical and emotional. She had seen me through so many changes in the past few months, and her unwavering belief in me kept me grounded. I can't believe how different this place feels, she said one afternoon, as we sipped coffee on the porch. It's like you've finally found yourself again, Grandma. I have, I said softly, watching the sunlight dappling the ground. For the first time in a long time, I'm not living for someone else. I'm living for me. Months passed, and while the future still held its uncertainties, I no longer felt as though I were walking on shaky ground. I was standing tall, on my own terms. The company was thriving, and while the dynamic between Walter and me had shifted, we were managing it. Michael, too, had grown in ways I hadn't expected, his understanding of the business, and of me, deepening as time went on. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But as I sat in my workshop one evening, working on a new project, I realized that I had found something more valuable than all the success or recognition in the world. I had found peace. I had found Barbara. And for the first time in my life, I could honestly say I was happy. Not because of anyone else, but because of the life I was creating for myself. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I was no longer afraid to walk it. I was writing my own story now.